to episode 5 of the Right on Cue podcast. Delighted to welcome my guest today. It's Marcus Stead. You might know him from various places. He's the editor of Snooker Scene. He does analyst work for talkSPORT Radio. So delighted to welcome Marcus today. How are you, Marcus? You all right?
Good afternoon, Mark. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Very, very busy week putting together the March Snooker Scene, but it's a pleasure to be with you. And I haven't seen you for just coming up to 5 years now, so it's good to be with you again.
It's been a while, to be fair, but probably the less we say about our last experience, the better. I had a bit of a nightmare.
Oh, it was wonderful. That was because I was commentating on.
Yeah.
That was my first ever commentary match, and you were refereeing. And I will never forget your face in the mid-session interval in that match. You looked absolutely exhausted.
It was a long one. It was a long one, but I made a bit of a mistake, didn't I? And that was I hold my hands up on that.
I'd forgotten about that actually. Go on, find me.
I shouldn't have mentioned it.
But everyone makes mistakes.
It is what it is. But, you know, everyone makes mistakes, don't they?
Well, you're older and wiser now, aren't you? We all are.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So right, we'll get cracking. It's got quite a few questions for yourself, so we'll get cracking. So, how did your love for snooker first come about?
Oh, good grief. Well, that would go back to, it would have been around about the mid-1980s when I was a toddler and when my grandmother was looking after me. This was the 1980s snooker boom. And I can just remember being in her living room. I'd be sat on the floor near her old cold fireplace. And Steve Davis was the man at the time. And he seemed to be on the telly constantly. And those were the days BBC, ITV, and a lot of ITV's coverage spilled over onto Channel 4 at that time. Snooker seemed to be on all the time whenever I was around her house being looked after in the daytime. And I just remember Steve Davis, I was fascinated by even at two and a half years of age. And I remember Len Ganley, John Williams. I remember them very, very clearly. So they were my earliest memories of snooker. And then it's always been there. I mean, I didn't get heavily involved in the game then until really, I would say, my early days of secondary school when I'd start playing the game. But it was always there. I mean, okay, in the 1990s, you had that slight dip. We didn't have Sky Sports at home at that time. So when ITV dropped their coverage at the early, 93-ish, they dropped their coverage. It was only the 4 BBC tournaments plus the Welsh Open I had access to. But snooker was always there. It never went away. So they were the very earliest memories of snooker for me.
Yeah. And was it just an instant love for the game?
I think so. I think I was lucky to be born in that era and be a toddler in that era when the 1980s snooker boom was going on. And other people round about my age tell similar stories. When I think of Gareth Allen, a friend of mine, North Wales, the former professional, he was, his grandparents played a big part in his snooker experience. But he would talk about he'd be sat on the floor with marbles and a pencil pretending to be a snooker player whilst it was on the television. I think a lot of enthusiasts of my generation, I'm 39 now, have got similar-ish sort of stories about how they became involved with the game in the beginning. That 1980s snooker boom, and being a toddler, okay, I wouldn't have understood all the rules. I wouldn't have understood all the subtleties. Yeah. But something grabs you, doesn't it? It's like when Clive Everton first went into, his snooker experience, it was a post-Christmas shopping trip to Oxford Street, and they bought all their Christmas presents in the sales. And he went to Leicester Square Snooker Hall because his father took him there, and he was hooked straight away as a very young boy, and he begged his father to buy him a miniature snooker table. I think a lot of people have those sorts of experiences when they're very young, and that was the case for me watching snooker, my late Italian grandmother being sat on the floor by the coal fire while the 1980s snooker boom was going on the telly. Wonderful times.
So you're now the editor of Snooker Scene. How did your journey begin to starting to work on Snooker Scene and then working your way up?
Oh, that would begin. Well, the thing is, I've been writing about sports since I was still at school, and I used to work on a website. I used to write articles for a website connected to what was the BDO World Darts Championship, the Embassy as it still was at the time. And I submitted the articles for that to a guy who worked at the Southampton Daily Echo newspaper. And he said, I like this, your work's got potential. And he published it on his website. That was the beginning of my writing journey. I then did my GCSEs, did my A-levels, went off to university in Liverpool, I worked on student radio. I was head of news at the student radio station. And then in about, it was around about the same year, I went to do my NCTJ journalism training. So we're talking about 2007. I went down to Highbury College in Portsmouth, late 2007, early 2008, a very intense 6-month period doing my NCTJ training. But a friend of mine and I realized at the time there weren't that many snooker websites. At that time, it was very different now. I mean, the internet is very different now in general. And the snooker tour was quite quiet at the time. It was that period when we were down to about 6 ranking tournaments plus the Masters. And we set up a website. It was supremesnooker.com. It doesn't exist anymore. And it was there was news and features, but it was very manageable because there were such long periods where not much was happening. And so with 6 ranking tournaments plus the Masters and uploading 1 or 2 new articles a week, it was quite easy to manage, among other things. So I was effectively working for free. We made a small amount of money from advertising. I think the sums were so small I can't remember them, to be honest. And then we ran that for a few years, and I picked up on certain stories that others weren't picking up on. We got to 2009, 2010, 2011. And of course, snooker was starting to pick up then from late 2009 when Barry Hearn, Jason Ferguson took control of the professional game. And I was getting busier and busier. It was getting harder to manage the website because there was just so much more going on. But I was sending stuff to Clive Everton. And he said to me, "Can you give me a call?" And I remember I gave him a call, and I think I missed him or something because he doesn't do mobile phones or anything, never has done. And I think it was about 10 o'clock one night, he rang me up on the landline. And we spent about an hour just chatting. And he said, "Oh, I can offer you some work at Snooker Scene." The tournament winners pages, which were there. And he said, "Can you expand them?" And I looked at it and I thought, yeah, I can. Started work. That was June 2011. And from there, I was effectively given freedom to expand the tournament winners pages as much as I wanted. And I immediately started noticing that countries like Germany that they were having good quality domestic tournaments that were underdeveloped. Belgium, Malaysia at that time, Australia, and I started adding that. And then I really started to expand it 2 years later. So we're into 2013 now, when I went to Daugavpils in Latvia for the IBSF World Championship. And the contacts I made there, particularly late night in the bar, I mean, what was it now? Lakpless's beer was about 80 pence a pint at that time.
Oh, nice.
So after a day's working in the press, well, it wasn't the press room. I was the only journalist working on it, but working in the tournament office, you could go there and the bar just did not close. You could be there well into the night. No one cared whose round it was because it was just so damn cheap.
Yeah.
But the important thing was, whilst it was fun, the contacts I made handing out business cards, then it really started to come in. Countries, I'm not going to use the word obscure, that's a bit disrespectful, but countries you wouldn't necessarily associate with snooker were sending me their tournament winners results and saying, "Oh, this is our website, keep an eye on it as well."
Okay.
And then all of a sudden, there were like 4 or 5 pages in every snooker scene with tournament winners from here, there, and everywhere.
That's good.
And that's really how I got involved in Snooker Scene. And from there, the spin-offs came along. I started to go to other parts of Snooker Scene as well, contributing to other parts of the magazine. Then, as you know, because you as I say, I was commentating my first ever match. You were refereeing on commentary. Some commentary work came along. I was already doing bits and bobs in radio anyway, and then talkSPORT brought me on board. So all sorts of things happened from that.
Yeah. So how do you approach finding like new and interesting content for Snooker Scene? Obviously, there's a lot of tournaments now, so that obviously keeps you busy. But is there anything that you do that sort of progress it a bit more, not just talk about tournaments?
Oh, that's a big thing. That's a big question, and there's no one single answer to it really, because you've got to be aware that if you go around looking on the various national governing body websites, you will see there's tournaments popping up all the time. Keep an eye on social media feeds. You'll find tidbits of stories. I mean, don't get me wrong, Mark. Maybe we're going to come on to this a bit later on. There's some absolute rubbish gets talked on snooker forums. There really is. I mean, some of the twaddle and some of ill-informed nonsense on every subject under the sun really is quite something. But you do find good tidbits of information. You think, hang on, there's a story in this. And a little thing, you can turn it into either a notebook item in Snooker Scene or a bigger feature. I mean, what I'm trying to do at the moment, and I'm sure we'll come on and talk more about Snooker Scene in a moment, is the investigative side of it, because Clive Everton's vision was always that it should be a mix of the Wisden cricketer in terms of it being a journal of record, and Private Eye in terms of it having a strong investigative element. Now, that strong investigative element, while it's never gone away, it hasn't been as prominent in the years since Barry Hearn took control of the professional game, because it hasn't needed to be in the same way as it used to be. In terms of, to summarize it, snooker was either run by players who knew nothing about business or business people who knew nothing about snooker. And now we've got a situation where snooker people who know about business are in charge, for all its many faults, and there are many faults at the moment. And there are certain things that are actually giving me significant cause for concern. But in terms of the amateur game, particularly, that investigative element is more important now than it has been in a long time. I'm keen to beef up that side of Snooker Scene.
Yeah, I mean, the amateur scene is incredible, really. There's so many top amateur players. It's so hard for them to get the professional tour card, I feel, at the minute, just because they're so good. All of them are so good. How do you feel about it?
Well, there's a number of routes onto the professional tour, as you and I know, and the split between the IBSF and the WPBSA has changed things in that the World Snooker Federation and the tournaments they've just had in Australia now, the WSF Championship and the WSF Junior Championship, I'll say this, they are now, as far as players are concerned, more important than the IBSF World Championship. Of that, there is no doubt, because they carry tour cards. And the competition field is that much stronger. We had that IBSF tournament in Turkey in, when was it now? November, December. I think it was November, actually. Their World Championship. And you look at who was there and who wasn't there. There was no one from England, no one from Scotland, no one from Northern Ireland, token presence from the Republic of Ireland, token presence from Wales, no one from China, no one from Australia. That's not a World Championship.
No.
I mean, go on.
I was just going to mention about the one in Australia that's just been. There was obviously talented players there, but because it's so far away, I do feel that they were just outpricing players. Unless you've got a sponsorship that's willing to pay you, because you've got your travel, accommodation, then your money to enter the tournament. I just felt it was a bit. It was well run. I just felt that they could have maybe done a bit more to get more players involved.
Well, this comes down to money, doesn't it? It's a long way away for us. It's not a long way away if you're from Australia. But we mustn't just think of it in a British context. But this is a problem across the board, isn't it? I mean, we had this situation before the pandemic where it was 5 trips to China for the professional players per season. And if they didn't go, that would have consequences in terms of ranking. So it was a difficult thing to get right in terms of Barry Hearn had this policy. I am not paying first round losers. OK, you can say that. That's now changed with, I mean, this media cliche, the cost of living crisis, but it is very real in terms of our energy bills and everything.
It's great that they've given 20,000 a year for the players. I think it's a good start.
I think it was absolutely necessary, because you had this situation where you could get on a plane and go to China, and you've paid for your flight, you've paid for your hotel. Because of the ranking system and the way the flat draws were made, you could be playing one of the best players in the world on the outside table, so you can't even say to your sponsor, look, my waistcoat patch has been on the TV. They've got nothing out of it. You'd lose your match, you'd be on a plane home, and you hadn't made a penny, and you'd lost a lot of money. Well, that's not sustainable, and it's no wonder that so many low-ranked professionals got demoralized as a result of that. And you think about it now, that jump between the best amateur players and making it on the pro tour is very, very hard. And I think about my years at Snooker Scene now and the tournament winners pages, and how many of the players I was writing about in 2011, 2012, 2013 in the tournament winners pages, the round the world pages, that have just fallen away now. I don't know. I literally do not know where they are. Now, for example, there was a player called Shane Castle, who was an English amateur player, who I seem to be writing his name every month in Snooker Scene. He'd won this, he'd won that at English amateur level. He had a good run in the 2013 UK Championship. I remember he did very well there. And then he seemed to fall by the wayside. And there were others like Kyron Wilson was a bit of an also-ran. I'd be writing his name occasionally, but he, as a quarterfinalist, semi-finalist, he'd win the odd thing here and there. And hey presto, he's now one of the world's best players. So those who make that leap from a good amateur to being professional, it's a very, very difficult bridge to get over. And part of it is money. That's a very big part of it. Part of it is getting used to the cameras and the lighting and everything else, and not being intimidated by your opponents. But this flat draw system is also utterly brutal, and it offers a lot of protection to those already in the top 16, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you do make a good point there. So, you've mentioned Clive Everton a couple of times. Voice of snooker for me. Obviously, when I was growing up, I'm a couple of years younger than yourself, but he was the voice of snooker when I was growing up. You obviously have a lot of contact with him. How's he doing nowadays?
I'm sorry to say he is struggling with life. He's pretty much housebound. I won't go into too much detail, but I'm afraid he's lost a lot of his independence now. And whilst his enthusiasm for snooker and billiards and cue sports in general remains undimmed, I'm afraid you won't be hearing any more of him on media interviews or seeing him on telly again. I'm sorry to say that. He needs a lot of care these days, but he's being well looked after. He's got a team of carers and he's got a loving family, which is the most important thing. Yeah.
Well, from everyone here at the Tamworth Sports Bar, if you could wish him our best, because like I say, he was the voice for me, and personally, I think he's probably the best commentator ever, in my opinion.
Well, in terms of, I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, everyone's got an opinion on who they like and who they don't. I mean, the old saying, opinions are like arseholes. Everyone's got one, haven't they? But, the thing about Clive, though, yes, for me, he is absolutely the best snooker commentator there has been, because he had experience both as a player and he was a solid player. He actually did turn professional for a period, but he was a solid player. But he's got that journalistic insight and that journalistic training.
Yeah.
But if you were to talk about Clive's biggest legacy, and we're going back to where we were a minute ago about the investigative side of Snooker Scene, I would say that his work as an investigative journalist is his most important legacy, because if he hadn't done what he's done, and bear in mind he's had 20 court cases with the WPBSA.
Oh, okay.
He's won every single one of them. And I think, go back to the Snooker Scene archives from the 70s to the 90s into the 2000s, month in, month out, hammering away at mismanagement in snooker. If he hadn't have done that, professional snooker would have died out or become very, very niche and on the margins of things years ago, because he called his semi-autobiographical book Black Farce and Cue Ball Wizards. Some of what went on going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s was beyond farcical. And if it wasn't for Clive exposing that, snooker would have died out as a mainstream professional sport a long, long time ago. And for me, that is his strongest legacy.
No, that's fair enough. So you're an analyst and a pundit for talkSPORT Radio. I'm guessing that came about because you'd done a lot of radio work before.
Yeah, I've been around radio for a long time, going back to when I was a student. I'd never really been away from radio for very long in one guise or another. I sort of fell into it by accident. I mean, David Hendon was actually talkSPORT snooker correspondent when it emerged from what was the original Talk Radio, which began in '95. It evolved into talkSPORT at the turn of the millennium. I think it was February, March 2000. It became talkSPORT. David Hendon was at a lot of tournaments for them in those days. They don't do so much of that now. I mean, they occasionally have reporters at tournaments, but I've been doing stuff. How I became involved in my current guys with talkSPORT was I've been doing stuff as a political analyst with one of my other hats on, and I covered when we had a hung parliament during the Theresa May era. Every by-election matters, because they were trying to get the Brexit deal through Parliament. And remember when John Bercow was Speaker, and it was every vote was on a knife edge, and every by-election matters as a result. And we had 3 by-elections We had the Newport West by-election after Paul Flynn died. We had the Fiona Onasanya by-election when she was disqualified and ended up going to prison. That was in what, Peterborough South, was it, or Luton, somewhere like that. And then we had the Brecon and Radnorshire by-election, and I was the overnight analyst covering the by-election on what was then the joint overnight show on talkSPORT and the revived Talk Radio. Just after Talk Radio was revived as a digital station, they had a joint overnight show with Paul Ross. Actually, I correct myself. It was Talk Radio only, and Paul was doing the overnight show. That was it. And I was the political analyst covering the elections. And that was great fun. I mean, I love covering by-elections anyway, because no matter how much prep you do, you don't know what the result's going to be for sure. And when it comes through, you've got to think very, very quickly. Write the results down, do a quick bit of analysis, boom, you're on air. And you've just got to run with it. And you've got to know your stuff, but run with it. They're great fun. And then after a little while, they said they were moving Paul Ross from Talk Radio to talkSPORT overnight. They were changing the format. They were moving him from Talk Radio to talkSPORT overnight. I just sent him a quick message and I said, all the best, Paul, with your show. And he said, thank you very much. Do you want to do a weekly snooker and darts slot? And I said, oh, yeah, thank you very much. And it went from there, really. And that was in September 2019. And in all the time since, even though all we've been through in the time since, I've only had 1 week off in all that time.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dedicated to the cause. I was going to ask you, obviously you do your talkSPORT, Snooker Scene, do you still do political work?
Yeah, I do, as and when. I mean, I do 2 days a week. I've gone back to my roots in the last year and a bit.
Yeah.
I've gone back into local newspapers, which is, something I was trained in and something I did a lot of in the late 2000s. I had an opportunity to go back to it. I mean, I'm disillusioned with local papers in general because a lot of them have gone down this clickbait route. And if you look in this month's Snooker Scene, you'll see I've written an article about it. Mark Williams was recently a victim of an appalling attempt at clickbait.
Oh, yeah, I saw it, yeah. Was that a bullying thing?
That was the Riley Powell.
Yeah. When they
and I thought Reach PLC and the Daily Mirror, I'm absolutely disgusted with them, to be honest.
Yeah,
I thought it was that. Well, I've written a big piece in Snooker Scene. You can read it. So I sort of fell away from local papers, and I became disillusioned with this chasing clickbait all the time. I mean, to me, a local paper should be about the court reporting, local councils, items of interest to the local community. But I had an opportunity to start working for the Glamorgan Star. When was it now? Late October of 2021. That was following the very sudden death of a good friend of mine, Sharon Harris, who was one of the best local newspaper journalists I've ever known, without a shadow of a doubt. But the Glamorgan Star, the owners of that, they're very much committed to the old ways of doing things, in that it is genuine, rooted local journalism. And, we've got 32,000 readers. It's a free paper. It's effectively modelled on the same basis as the Metro newspaper on a national basis, where, you can pick it up in a supermarket. I know you pick up your Metro paper on public transport mainly, don't you? But you pick up the Glamorgan Star at the supermarket, corner shop, and various other outlets, cafes in the area. And I've gone back into that partly because I wanted to carry on Sharon's legacy, because it was still a fairly new paper, and I thought, I'd like to carry on what she's done, but also because they are genuinely committed to the community. So I cover everything. I do 2 days a week there. I cover absolutely everything: sport, politics, you name it. I do bits and bobs of political writing. I still do my podcast. talkpodcasts.com is the.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that as well.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. I do lots of political stuff on there. I appear on I do bits and bobs on Talk TV, which is what Talk Radio has evolved into. I do political stuff on there when asked to. So yeah, I'm still around, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
So obviously you do all of this work. My question was going to be is, when do you sleep?
Very occasionally and very badly. I'm not a good sleeper, Mark. I'm on the radio in the middle of the night. When do I sleep? 5-6 hours, not always a night. Sometimes I sleep into the mornings and into lunchtimes. I don't keep regular hours, that much is for sure. But hey, if it's the requirements of the job, it's the requirements of the job, isn't it? And I've always found, actually, even going back to my student days, if I had like an essay deadline or something, the early hours of the morning are a good time to get things done, because there's so few distractions.
Yeah,
If you can just focus, and not everyone's a nighttime person. Some people function very well early in the morning. That's fine as well. We're all different in that sense. And I've read books on this. Our body clocks are different. We all have a better time of day. I could just find if I had an essay and I had to write several thousand words and I needed to nail it when I was at uni, the early hours of the morning when it's calm, there's no distractions, you can just focus, you can get a lot done in a very short space of time.
yeah.
So using those hours, and I still do now. I've got something a bit tricky to write, and I need to focus. I need to concentrate, get it right. When the phone's not buzzing every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
There's no distractions in general. Getting things done in the early hours does work for me.
Okay. We've spoke a little bit about you doing your snooker commentary. You do a lot of the snooker commentary online now, don't you?
Yeah, I haven't done any for quite a while actually. It's something I'd like to do more of, but it's a very, it's like, what happens. That 2018, that weekend, I did the junior matches to begin with.
Yeah.
And obviously you were there. Then on the Sunday, we had the English amateur final, which was Joe O'Connor against Andrew Norman.
I was the marker in that one.
You were. And that was, both players were actually capable of playing better than they did that day. But the way Joe has just pushed on now into the he is well and truly. I talked about that bridge and getting over that bridge from being a good amateur to being a professional. He's well and truly done that in quite a short space of time. Because by the time he played in that final, he'd already got his professional status, as I recall.
Yeah,
he came through the playoffs, didn't he?
Yeah.
And but the thing about what happened there was, everyone said to me, "Oh, you did really well. I enjoyed your commentary," and a lot of people said a lot of very kind things. Then we had 2019, and there was no commentary that year. There was online streaming. There was no commentary, and I think that was the year that they had it at an afternoon, because ITV4, I think they were in Gloucester or Cheltenham. Cheltenham they would have been. That was it, Cheltenham, because the Southwest Snooker Academy had closed by that stage, I think. Paul Mount's place, where we were that weekend in 2018. It was one of the ITV tournaments, and there was no TV coverage on a Saturday afternoon because they don't do TV coverage on a lot of the ITV tournaments on Saturday afternoons because they need the slot for horse racing and other things. And they had the English amateur final in that arena that year. And they cut the format right back, and I think it was a far fewer number of frames.
I think it was in Sheffield because I was there that year. I'm sure
it wouldn't have been Sheffield. It was one of the ITV tournaments they had it at, right? And what happened?
Sorry, I was talking about the amateur championship.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, they had the English amateur final, if I remember rightly.
Oh, I think that was I know what you mean.
Yeah. And what happened was, it was streamed online, but there was no commentary, right? Yeah. And I think it was the day after that. I may be getting my years mixed up a little bit. I don't think I am, though. The English amateur governing body folded the following day, just one day later. And they were in financial trouble, hence they had no money for commentary to a commentator. And then now obviously a new governing body came through very quickly, and they're doing some good work. But they haven't yet got to the stage where they brought commentary back. The trouble is, commentary is not something I would ever do for free, frankly. I think it's a skill you'd have to pay for. I don't expect a plumber to work for free. You shouldn't expect a commentator to work for free. I'd like more opportunities, but money isn't around that much. And also, in terms of TV commentary, it's the same thing. Even with Eurosport, right? We got all this Discovery Plus stuff, wonderful service, and people moan. You see it on forums. Why aren't Eurosport showing the Sunday afternoon session of this? And I always say, I remember when I was a very young kid, going back to my early days, do people actually remember that it was only the World Championship final that was shown live and in full on a Sunday night?
Yeah.
The other BBC tournaments, right, like the Masters, what they would do is they would come on air at 7:00. You'd get like the first hour or so. Then you'd have, and it was BBC One, the Masters. World Championship was BBC Two, the Masters was BBC One. And what they would do is they would then go off air at like 7:45. You'd have your Sunday night programming. Then you'd have the news at round about 9:00. Then about 9:15, they'd go back to the snooker, which may or may not be live, depending on whether the final had finished. If it hadn't finished, they'd have a quick recap of what you'd missed and then go into the arena. If it had finished, you'd have effectively highlights. And that was the norm. And also, I remember, even later than that, when, eventually by about 93, 94-ish, all 4 of the BBC tournament finals were on BBC Two. But during the week, it would be, they'd come on air at 6:45. They'd have a recap of the afternoon's action. You then have the first half hour live of the evening. Then David Vine's voice would break in. We now have to leave this coverage. Join us after Newsnight at 11:20 for highlights. And that was your lot. Tough luck. Yeah. Nowadays, obviously, we got Red Button and the online stream. But people, they go, oh, why can't Eurosport show this? Well, first of all, it's on the Eurosport streaming service, point 1. And point 2, hey, you may not have absolute perfection, but we're a hell of a lot better off than we were in the old days. But the thing about the Eurosport streaming, to go back where I was, we got a bit distracted there. The Eurosport streaming of the outer tables, and when it's not televised, they don't have commentary because they too are on a budget. They too. I mean, I know how much the commentators get paid per day. I'm not going to say on here, but I do know. It would involve another cut into their budget to pay them. Now, I'd love to do that sort of thing. All right, the stage I'm obviously a lot younger than David Hendon and Phil Yates. Stage I'm at, I would be happy to take work on the outside tables. I'm not precious about it. I would do it, no problem at all. But again, it's getting those opportunities. It is not easy. There's only a small amount of room for TV commentary. We get the same names a lot. Be nice to break in, but it's getting that opportunity. And the problem is, of course, for me to come in, someone else would have to come out. That's a brutal reality. And I'm not going to go around demanding they get rid of or cut back friends of mine. Ultimately, I'm just not going to do it. There's a right and a wrong way to do things. Opportunity. I mean, look, the big names in TV commentary now all ended up there by accident. All of them, right? Phil Yates, let's start with him, right? Meter World Masters 1991, NEC in Birmingham. There was, I believe I've got this right, and I apologize publicly to Phil if I've got this wrong. My understanding is he was there as a print journalist, and there was a football commentator working on the coverage who wasn't enjoying it that much. Not because he didn't like snooker, he felt he didn't quite fit in. And Phil was asked to commentate. He said, "Oh, let's try you out." He commentated on a frame that had taken place on videotape that had taken place earlier that afternoon, which he'd already sat through and knew exactly what was happening, so he could sound like a flaming know-it-all when he was doing his audition, if you like. And it went well, and it was fine. And he actually, Phil and I were talking the other day. Dickie Davis, who died earlier this week, one of the greats of snooker television, was presenting the Eurosport coverage that week. This was after Dickie had left ITV. And he said Dickie was the most encouraging, generous, kind man in terms of Phil making his debut. And hey, Phil made his debut that week on the Eurosport coverage. And it went from there. And he was there alongside the 2 friends of mine no longer with us now, Peter Brackley, Mike Watterson, people who are still with us, Jim White, Robbie Foldvari, Willie Jameson, Paul Wade. They had a very, very strong commentary team on Eurosport for that week. The Meter World Masters, a wonderful tournament. It was promoted independently of the WPBSA by Barry Hearn. And it had a Wimbledon style format, men's singles, women's singles, men's doubles, women's doubles, mixed doubles, and a junior tournament. And the junior final, which is still on YouTube, was John Higgins against Mark Williams. I won't spoil the result in case you want to sit through it. But that was Phil's beginning, totally by accident, right place, right time. David Hendon started off doing a small amount of work for Eurosport as a complete one-off. It was meant to be a one-off contract in about 2005, because Mark Wildman was doing a lot for Eurosport at that time. And I know, well, he's not in the best of health now, sadly, but he was retiring to Spain. I know he did some pool commentary for them even after that with that 8-ball tour coverage they had, American 8-ball pool tour, which ran for a few years. I know Mark came back and did that. But he was going to Spain, and that turned out to be David's way in. And again, with Clive Everton, okay, he started out on regional ITV, HTV Wales, Thames, and Granada. He did work for them, mainly as a summariser, actually, to begin with, rather than a lead commentator. HTV Wales, there was a program called Sports Arena, which was a multi-sport program in the Pontcanna studios, now long demolished in Cardiff. Hugh Johns was lead commentator, best known as a football commentator. ITV's man at the 1966 World Cup final when Kenneth Wolstenholme was on the BBC. But Hugh commentated on a number of sports. He had a wonderful, rich voice, Hugh Johns, and he was lead commentator. Clive was summariser. On Granada, it was Gerald Sinstadt, who died last year, the football commentator, with Clive as summariser. And at Thames, he took over from, again, this won't mean anything to you, Mark. There was a guy called Shaw Taylor who used to do Police 5. The police, it was like a crime and awareness slot. There were versions of it on TVS on the South Coast, London Weekend Television, and Central Television in the Midlands. And Shaw Taylor did lots of other things. He was ITV's man at like royal weddings and big funerals and you name it. But he also did snooker commentary for Thames. And I was the last person to interview Shaw Taylor. I interviewed him when he was 89 years of age. And it's on my blog, this interview. And he died just a few months later at the age of 90. And he said to me, he loved his snooker, loved playing it, not playing it very well, but he loved his snooker, wasn't enjoying the commentary. He knew he didn't fit in as a snooker commentator on Thames. He stood down, and Clive was invited for an audition. And what they did is he was taken for a great lunch at Stoke Poges Golf Club. This is how crazy this world is and how crazy television can be. 2 executives from Thames Television. They go to Stoke Poges, right? And they have a scrumptious lunch. Now, Clive has never been a big drinker. The other 2 blokes who were with him were big drinkers, and it was all going on the expenses account, which in those days you could do. You could get away with that sort of thing. So that they all had a scrumptious lunch. The other 2 blokes are drunk, no 2 ways about it. Clive is stone cold sober, and they say, right, let's retire to the snooker room. And I think I may be getting the players wrong. One of them said, I'll pretend to be Fred Davis, and the other one said, I'll pretend to be John Spencer. These 2 blokes could barely pot a red, let alone make a break. They were so drunk. And Clive had to stand in the corner of the room and pretend to be commentating. Well, the standard was just appallingly bad. Anyway, this came to an end, and Clive drove home. He was in a fit state to drive. The other 2 blokes, goodness knows how they got home. And Clive thought, oh, God, nothing's going to come of this. They were just so drunk. That was just a ploy for them to have a lunch on the expenses, etc. Anyway, he got a phone call a day or so afterwards. Clive, you've got the job. And that was Clive's way into Thames. And so that was how Clive started with ITV. And then, as I say, you know, when ITV started networking snooker, he was their man in the early days when Ted Lowe went exclusive with the BBC, because Ted Lowe used to do both channels at one time. Ted went exclusive with the BBC. But at the World Championship, that was a funny story as well, how he started with the BBC. Because 1977, there was limited coverage on the BBC. It was mainly highlights with longer coverage of the final. 1978, I think it was, they went the works, the full works. And there was Nick Hunter, the producer, realized, whoops, we better get some more commentators in because we're covering both tables at once. And he went up to Clive and he said, Clive, we're going to need more commentators. I know you've done stuff for ITV. Can you commentate for us? And Clive said, yeah, sure. When do you want me to start? Nick looked at his watch and said, quarter of an hour. That's true. Clive made his BBC commentary debut at quarter of an hour's notice. So these things all tend to happen a little bit by accident. I'm not saying things are quite as crazy now as they were in the 70s, but you look at it, Clive, Phil Yates, David Hendon, it's all right place, right time. There's no answer to this. So what I'm saying is, Mark, just give me the opportunity and I'm in there.
Well, you know, if someone's watching, then, you know, you never know what might happen. What do you think is the key aspect that makes a good commentator or an analyst for snooker?
Right, this is important because I think the jobs of lead commentator and summariser are 2 different jobs.
Yeah.
ITV know this, Eurosport know this, BBC don't know this. If you're watching a football match and you put, say, Gary Neville and Martin Keown together, it wouldn't work because they're both summarisers.
Yeah.
Or Gary Neville and Andy Townsend or anything like that. If you put the late John Motson and Martin Keown together, it would work. Because in all sports, with the possible exception of cricket, it works best when you've got a lead commentator and a summariser, a lead commentator from a journalistic background and a summariser who's an ex-player. And having that balance, their roles are different. The role of the lead commentator is to offer context and journalistic analysis, and the ex-player in snooker is really about shot analysis, whereas the lead commentator is about wider context. So, and David Hennon and Phil Yates do this very well, is that they leave the bulk of the shot analysis up to the ex-player, and they themselves add the context and the stats and, add a little bit of poetry to it here and there where they can. So they're different jobs. And I think the big thing also to do, and this is where Clive really was the master, knowing when to speak and knowing when not to speak. Be very sparing with your words and knowing when to take a step back and not to speak. And I think sometimes, particularly on the BBC coverage, there's too many words. A lot of the time, there are too many words. And the thing about the BBC coverage, whilst they've got some very good commentators as analysts and summarisers, the BBC is lacking lead commentators now because they no longer recognise they've gone for this highly conversational approach, which can lead to too much talking. It can also lead to players talking about themselves a little bit too much. But that's something that ITV and Eurosport get right, and I'm afraid I think the BBC gets wrong.
No, you see, I prefer the BBC commentary team, just personal preference. I prefer it. But,
can I ask you something then?
Yeah.
If you were watching a football match, you wouldn't want two ex-players alongside each other. That would not work because you're identifying players, and you've got to obviously know who all of them are. If it was just a rabbiting thing, that would not work. I think this is it's something the BBC have done deliberately. I mean, Clive left the BBC in what was it, 2010, something like that. And the way he left the BBC, the way they gave him his cards was absolutely appalling, by the way.
it was.
But it's something you wouldn't do it with the possible exception of cricket. You wouldn't do it in any other sport.
Fair enough. So, what do you think sets the snooker world apart from any other sports, and what do you think it keeps attracting audiences and players coming up through the ranks?
Well, what the big strength of the 1980s snooker boom was that everybody in the country was following it. It felt that way at the time. I mean, the old saying, it was Dallas with balls or Coronation Street with balls. Yeah. Everybody had a favourite player. Everybody had a player they didn't like. And that was a big factor in the 1980s snooker boom. What keeps people coming back is the unpredictability of it all. You've got Ronnie O'Sullivan, who's still the game's box office attraction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet you never know which version of him is going to turn up on any given day. There are days where he literally doesn't want to be there, it feels. And there are days where he is absolutely phenomenal. And that keeps people coming back. But it's the unpredictability of it. And snooker sometimes, no matter how long you've been around, if you're Clive Everton's age and you've seen it all and done it all, no two frames are ever the same. And the big thing is who cracks first under extreme pressure. That can be the big thing. And that is absolutely thrilling television. And it keeps people coming back. Okay, yes, certain things happened in the early 1990s, particularly, with ITV initially cutting back and then dropping snooker completely for a period and mismanagement within the game. There was a dip in the early 1990s. But snooker's never really been away. And no matter how badly the game was run, and good grief, for many years it was incredibly badly run, the TV viewing figures have always remained pretty good. And there was never anything fundamentally wrong with the game itself, just the way it was managed. So it keeps people coming back. And you don't need to be gimmicky about it. Okay, we get the shootout once a year. There's no need for gimmicks. People we have different formats. Some tournament formats are much longer than others.
Yeah.
No one would ever come up with a World Championship format as it is from scratch these days. No one would ever think, hey, let's have the semi-finals that take place over 3 days. No one would think of that these days. Yeah. But somehow it works.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
It keeps people coming back. So young, old, middle-aged, it's for everybody, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah, I think so too. So what sort of advice would you give youngsters that want to get into snooker, maybe as an analyst or as a commentator? What sort of advice would you give?
Train as a plumber because it pays more. No, plumbers, electricians, there's a real shortage of them. I know that because I got a property business as well, and believe me, that's where the money is these days. But if money is not your prime motivation and you're serious about making it in journalism, start off find your own niche is how I would put it. I mean, the thing about snooker, there's niches for all sorts of people. Take Chris Downer, who produces the Crucible Almanac. He's found his niche there, and he does it very well. Find your niche, maybe start a blog or something, and find your feet, and accept that you're going to be on a journey, and it's not going to happen to you overnight. You're going to need a lot of patience and perseverance. Train as a journalist, do an NCTJ accredited course, because you will learn, like I did it in Highbury College in Portsmouth 2 years after I graduated from Liverpool Uni. My degree's in politics and communication studies. I got that from Liverpool Uni. I actually went into book writing for a period. I've written 3 books, unofficial biographies.
You don't stop, do you?
Oh, I never stop working.
Do everything.
Yeah, I've written unofficial biographies of Frankie Dettori, though I had a lot of cooperation from his manager there, actually. Brian O'Driscoll, the ex-Ireland and Lions rugby captain, and Kevin Peterson, the cricketer. So I wrote those books. I started doing that in that 2-year gap between me finishing uni and going to Portsmouth. But that 6 months in Portsmouth, late 2007, 2008, early 2008, that NCTJ accredited course where you learn shorthand, public affairs, media law, in the mornings and early afternoons, then you have your lunch break, and then in the afternoons you're in a newsroom environment. It was a brutal training school because you're effectively reducing a master's degree level course into 6 months. Yeah. It was brutal, but it was tremendous fun, and it was a good training school, and you leave with your certificate and you passed all your exams, you're NCTJ recognized, and those skills you can then take into journalism. And then the thing is, once you've got your NCTJ, it opens doors for you because people can employ you saying, yeah, this person knows their media law, their shorthand, public affairs. Yeah. Media law is very important because you're learning about libel, defamation, qualified privilege, absolute privilege. And it's like I say to everybody, for crying out loud, do not comment on social media on ongoing court cases. There is no special laws for journalists, and there's no special laws for members of the public. We are all subject to the same laws. If you are giving a running commentary on an ongoing court case, and you're not actually in the court as a court reporter knowing how far you can go, for crying out loud, don't do it, because there's no special laws for you. You could easily be in contempt of court. It's like that clown, Tommy Robinson, nasty piece of work. When he was commentating on the Asian, well, they weren't Asian, they were Northern Pakistanis, but the grooming gang story outside Canterbury Court, he was there with his camera on his phone, and he was doing a piece to camera. He nearly caused that court case to collapse. Through his own stupidity. He landed himself in prison through his own stupidity. So I say to people, for crying out loud, do not comment on ongoing court cases. You're leaving yourself wide open to all sorts of potential things. But look, if you're serious about making it in journalism, as I say, maybe start a blog, find your niche, do your NCTJ, and then keep knocking on doors. I did with Clive Everton. I started that snooker website. I was sending stuff to Clive. Clive, look what I found. Look what I found. Look what I found. Next thing you know, he wants to speak to me, and hey presto, I'm working for Snooker Scene. I've been there ever since. Yeah, you just got it. It's very, very hard these days because local newspapers are 90%. I'm lucky. I work for the Glamorgan Star, which is a proper one. Most local newspapers are rubbish these days. I mean, the 6 monthly or yearly figures, because some are on a 6 monthly cycle, some are on a yearly cycle. The circulation figures came out earlier this week. The South Wales Echo has only got just above 6,000 copies per day being sold now. Western Mail, same thing. South Wales Argus in Newport, where I did a lot of work experience, 2007, 2008. They're lower still. They're down, I think it was 4,000, something like that. Local newspapers are in trouble now, and they're not that good a training ground anymore. Finding your way in is very, very hard. The other thing, of course, work experience. If you can get work experience in the right places, easier said than, but there are opportunities out there. What you'll need is a lot of patience and a lot of perseverance, but do keep going. And like I say, make your presence felt, but do get your NCTJ, as I say, in terms of shorthand, which is still a useful skill, particularly in court reporting, because you can't take dictaphones.
My mum can write shorthand.
Yeah, is she Pitman or T-line?
I couldn't tell you. I just know she knows how to do it.
She'll be able to tell you. The more modern way is T-line. Older people tend to use Pitman. But if you're in court, you can't turn a dictaphone on, right? So that's the only way you can keep a record of what's going on in court. So it still has its uses. I mean, I've got a slight problem with the joint in the finger of my index finger on my right hand. It's a bit tender. So if I'm not in court, I am using a dictaphone almost all of the time these days because of that. For that reason, I find it hard to handwrite these days. I have got a problem in the joint here. But hey, if I need to do it, I will do it. And court reporting, you have to have that skill. Public affairs, PA, as I say, that's very, very useful to know. That's an element of the NCTJ course. Media law, very important. And then that newsroom experience, still very useful. So get your NCTJ is what I would say to people.
Yeah, fair enough. So what do you see as the role of social media in the snooker world and how that can attract more people to watch as well?
I love it and I hate it, is the answer. I love it and I hate it. You know as well as I do, Mark, there are some absolute idiots on snooker groups on social media. Notice how everyone's suddenly a big expert on what's going on with the Chinese players.
I mean, I've tried to distance myself from talking about that. I don't think...
I'm not going to talk about it.
No, I don't think I'm personally in a position to talk about it because it's still ongoing.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mark. And I'm only going to talk about it insofar as what I've written as the editorial in this month's Snooker Scene. What I've done there is I've stuck purely to facts and analysis. I've said, you look at my editorial in this month's Snooker Scene. These are the facts. This is where we are. The process is now with Nigel Moore, who is investigating. He's a very experienced man, ex-Scotland Yard. He investigated the Pakistani cricket team. He did the inquiry into the House of Commons, House of Lords expenses scandal. He's done this, he's done that. I said, this is where we are. Let's let him get on with it. Essentially, that was my editorial. This is what they're accused of. Boom, 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 boom. Nigel Moore is now in charge, very experienced. We're lucky to have someone of his expertise. But then you go onto social media and Fred from the Dog and Duck has suddenly got it all worked out. He knows a lot more than you and me all of a sudden. He knows what he thinks of Chinese people in general. He doesn't like the Chinese people in general. He knows what he thinks about gambling and who's been doing what. He suddenly knows a hell of a lot more than Jason Ferguson and Nigel Moore, who've been talking to all the betting firms and have got all the analysis in front of them. And there's been this due process. Suddenly, this bloke from the pub knows more, or this bloke who's gone on one of the snooker forums at 11 o'clock at night. He's got it all worked out all of a sudden. Now, I can't get into discussions with people like that, Mark. I don't see the point of it. What can they possibly add to my life, these people? And Twitter's the worst of the lot for this. It really is. Because in Twitter, you're not responsible for what you say because you can hide behind a pseudonym. So you can be the ultimate coward, set up a pseudonym and say the most obnoxious things, and yet have to face no responsibility for your actions. And that to me is absolutely appalling. At Twitter, you can shout your mouth off and not have to take any responsibility. So it's the worst of worlds, but it can also be the best of worlds. Yeah. In that it can bring people together. It can keep you in contact with people you would otherwise lose contact with. And you get good tidbits of information out there. So it's the best of worlds and it's the worst of worlds. But there is no point in trying to debate with some people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. So what do you see as the biggest challenges facing snooker in the future? Do you think this whole betting, gambling scandal that's sort of going on at the minute, do you think that's short term, that's obviously a big thing, but long term, do you think there are going to be any other challenges sort of coming up?
Right, Mark. This is a big question, and it's an important question, and it's something I've addressed in this month's Snooker Scene. It's something I'm going to be coming back to in the months ahead, no doubt about it. The whole growth we've seen in snooker going from 2009, one of the first things that happened in early 2010, Barry Hearn got talkSPORT on board as sponsor of the Welsh Open. Mm-hmm. That was the first time they'd had a sponsor since I think 2003, when Regal cigarettes had to stop for the tobacco advertising ban. From that point onwards, almost every snooker tournament, certainly in Britain, has been sponsored by gambling firms.
They have, yeah.
And I remember Ian Doyle, the former manager, wrote a letter to Snooker Scene only about 2 or 3 years into Barry Hearn's tenure. And he said, look, Barry Hearn and I have not always seen eye to eye, which Ian Doyle and Barry Hearn had not seen eye to eye historically. But he said, I congratulate him on what he's achieved. But the big downside is that so much of it is dependent on gambling advertising. And he said he knew through contacts he had the blue chip companies, by which he meant insurance firms, car firms, these sort of more sort of high-end companies were put off investing in snooker because it was so closely associated with the gambling fraternity. And that has continued in the years since. Now, what has happened is maybe, well, only in the last 2 years, really. I actually let Barry Hearn know in an email years ago that at some point the government was going to twig just what a big problem we've got in this country and beyond with problem gambling. Because, okay, gambling has always been a menace to society, but we've gone from a situation where you had to go into a betting shop or a casino with cash in your hand to, in the 2000s, sitting in front of your desktop or your laptop, to today, from the 2010s, early 2010s onwards, where you literally do not have to get out of your seat. You can sit there with numerous apps on your smartphone, and you could be sat at home, drunk, late at night, lonely, bored, and you're gambling. You can turn your living room into a casino, in effect. And it's not even, it doesn't feel like real money because you're on the credit card. So you're drunk, you're alone, you've got your credit card. And it's no wonder that particularly young people, there's so much problem gambling. Now, the government, UK government, has been saying for the last 2 years there's going to be a white paper to go through the House of Commons and then the House of Lords on this. They've put it off because obviously we've had a lot of political turmoil with one thing and another. The time when that's going to come before Parliament is now quite near. I think it's going to be this year. It could even be within the next few months. I don't think it's going to be that much longer now. And the rules around gambling advertising are going to be tightened up considerably. Where that'll leave sports sponsorship, I'm not quite sure. But this business of, Ray Winston coming on the telly, get your laptops out now, Bet365, or okay, the law's been tightened a little bit in the last few months. You can't have sports stars doing them anymore. So, getting Peter Crouch to do it, that's not allowed anymore. But the law is going to be tightened up considerably. And I think Barry Hearn knows this, and Steve Dawson know it, and Jason Ferguson knows it. What they've done is they've put all their eggs in this kazoo basket.
Yes.
Now, I've written a big piece in this month's Snooker Scene. Kazoo is undoubtedly in big trouble. Undoubtedly. Because the way they came on the scene, they only started to exist in 2018. Alex Chesterman, who was a tech entrepreneur, started the company. And the next thing you know, they've gone from not existing to having these huge car showrooms here, there, and everywhere. And they then started expanding into continental Europe, and they were sponsoring Real Sociedad football clubs and Olympique Marseille, and they expanded in 2021 into 2022 into continental Europe. Then they started pulling out of continental Europe within like a year or two, if that, of launching there, right? In this country, they're sponsoring the Wales Rugby Union team, the Derby, the St. Ledger, the 100 in cricket, Aston Villa, Everton. It goes on. The list goes on, right? And now they're starting to pull out very quickly, right? And then the New York Stock Exchange, they had this huge valuation when they launched on there on the summer of 2021. I think it was something ridiculous, like $6 billion US. January now, just gone this year, mid-January, their shares was suspended from trading on the New York Stock Exchange. It was suspended. Alex Chesterman, he's still with the company. He's been given a different role now. He's no longer chief executive. New York Stock Exchange is now trying to delist them. They've ending their sponsorship of Aston Villa end of the season. They, in snooker, whilst they're doing the Triple Crown events, they're no longer sponsoring the Players Series. Now, you think, Mark, it looked as though the Players Series wasn't going to have a sponsor. It was only on the morning of the first day of the World Grand Prix that Dual Bits was announced as the sponsor. And since Kazoo launched on the New York Stock Exchange, it was only in the summer of 2021, they've lost 97% of their value. Most of their UK showrooms are closing this year. They're only keeping 6 of them. The one up the road from me in Penarth Road in Cardiff is due to be closed. The one in Edinburgh just had £1 million refit. That refit just completed, just reopened. That one's going to close. Kazoo, they're in big trouble. Now, if Kazoo disappear, that leaves the World Championship, the UK Championship, the Masters without a sponsor. It leaves the PDC World Darts Championship without a sponsor. The Masters Darts, I think I'm right in saying Premier League darts as well. Certainly at least one other big darts tournament. They're pulling out of their sponsorship for the 100 in cricket. That's confirmed. Wales Rugby Union team would be in trouble. The classics in horse racing would be without a sponsor. But for snooker and for PDC darts in particular, if Kazoo goes, they got big problems. So with gambling being tightened up and with Kazoo in trouble, that's where the problems are, Mark.
Yeah. Do you think that what other sort of companies could get involved in sponsorship? Because like I said, the gambling you can't do, cigarette companies you obviously can't do now. If Kazoo's going down, like you've just said, is there any other big companies out there that could jump on board?
Well, think of where we were historically. We had the Royal Liver Assurance UK Championship. We had the Liverpool Victoria Charity Challenge. Liverpool Victoria then sponsored the UK Championship. Pucker Pies sponsored the UK Championship at the end of the Rodney Walker era. But this isn't a problem for snooker. The sports sponsorship market in general has been in trouble for quite a while now. And by that, I mean almost everything that used to be sponsored by tobacco is now sponsored by gambling firms. And even when you're watching the football or anything like that, look at the amount of gambling advertising that surrounds it. There aren't that many sponsors, whether it's mobile phone firms or insurance companies or car companies, really going near sport sponsorship in the way they once were. Now, how much of that is a sign of the times? I mean, sponsorship in general, one of the reasons you don't get good independent local radio that often anymore, everywhere you go now up and down Britain, it's heart, capital, smooth. Everywhere you go. The reason we've lost all our local radio stations is that if you had a local car showroom or even a national chain of car showrooms, local radio or local newspapers was really where you had to go. Today, online advertising in various forms, targeting you on Facebook or what have you, advertisers have got so many more options now, and Facebook and elsewhere, they're hoovering a lot of it up. And there isn't that much money going around in general, and sports sponsorship is an expensive business. I mean, like, take the English Football League. Used to be Nationwide Building Society. It's now Sky Bet, isn't it? Sky Bet. These things, it's a difficult thing. I mean, I would love it if, snooker tournaments were sponsored by Barclays Bank or Ford Cars or Aviva Insurance, you name it. I would love that. I think it would be a much healthier situation. Yeah. But it's easier said than done, of course, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously. Right, a couple more questions before we sign off. If there was a Mount Rushmore of snooker, who would you put on it? It doesn't have to be players. You could have commentators, referees, anyone you want. If you could have any four on a Mount Rushmore of snooker, who would you have?
Are you terms on being stuck somewhere with people, or you're talking about who do I admire the most? What's your question?
Well, just if there was a Mount Rushmore, who would you put on it?
In terms of what now? I want to answer the question as best I can. I know what Mount Rushmore is.
Yeah,
but
it could be anyone you like. You could be a player. It could be
and I'm allowed four, am I?
Anyone.
People I admire.
Yeah.
People I admire. In terms of his sheer breadth of knowledge, Clive Everton, because the way he's contributed as a player, as a commentator, but also as an investigative journalist. Clive Everton in his pomp would be a superb company for anything like that. The anecdotes he's got. I mean, everyone should read Black Farce and Cue Ball Wizards, because you want to know all that's gone on in snooker, the behind-the-scenes stuff that Clive has exposed. Black Farce and Cue Ball Wizards is a summary of all that's gone on. That 400 or 500 pages, whatever it is a short version. The long version, he could talk forever about that, Clive. So, Clive, Barry Hearn, king of the quips. Yeah. You can smell a fiver in a gale force wind, no problem at all. Fascinating company. Yeah. Steve Davis, he had this reputation as Mr. Poker Face, Mr. Bland, Mr. Hook. You see him in social situations, or get him in the right environment, he's hilarious. Yeah. He's a very good storyteller, very funny man. And the fourth would be my late friend Mike Watterson, the guy who took the World Championship to the Crucible in 1977, created the UK Championship from scratch, also created the British Open, International Open, the Snooker World Cup, also a TV commentator for Sky and Eurosport in the 90s. Mike was a fascinating man.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that it was his wife that said to him about the Crucible?
Right, yeah, it was his late wife Carol. Mike later, after Carol sadly died in '91, he then married Diane, who still is a friend of mine. It was Carol, father of his twin boys, Nick and Andy, and I think they'd not long married actually, and it was a girls' night out to see a play at the Crucible. And I asked Mike what was the play. He couldn't remember that, but she went to see a play and she came home. And Mike had been moaning for a while. He thought, you know what, there could be no World Snooker Championship next year, he was saying, because Embassy Tobacco was annoyed. I think the World Championship was split between Manchester and Middlesbrough the previous year, 76. And you can look up photographs of that, of what it was like in 76. It was not well run.
No.
It looked horrendous. But Carol came home from that play and she said, I think I found the perfect venue for snooker. What you can see behind me there. The Crucible Theatre in Sheffield. And Mike went down there and he met Arnold Aliman, the theatre's manager. And he said, this looks really good. And Arnold said, I think we haven't quite got enough space on this stage for 2 tables. And he gave the measurements to Mike. And Mike said, oh, damn, that's really disappointing. And Arnold said, don't take my word for it. I've never actually measured it. Should we get a measuring tape?
Yeah.
Got a measuring tape. There was just enough room for 2 tables, and you know the rest.
Yeah.
So I miss Mike hugely because he used to just ring me up and we wouldn't just talk snooker. We'd talk football, darts, we'd talk politics a lot.
Yeah.
He was a real no-nonsense character, but a very good friend of mine. I miss him hugely. I'm delighted his great nephew, Ryan, is now working for us at Snooker Scene. He's younger than me. He's a very good young journalist, Ryan. He's made the right stuff. But Mike, yeah, so he would be my 4th one. So they're my snooker people then. So that's Clive Everton, Barry Hearn, Steve Davis, and Mike Watterson.
Excellent. Right, final question that I always ask all the guests on here. What's your funniest snooker story?
Oh, right, yeah. This was Luton Airport 2013. And I wasn't at all surprised when I was taken to one side and patted down, searched. There's people that do that, people do that to me. They think, I bet this guy looks dodgy, we better search him. I think it was the mirrored sunglasses that did it, Mark.
Maybe.
No, I'm only kidding. I wasn't wearing mirrored sunglasses, but I was taken aside and they wanted to search me. Okay, fine. And then we went through to the bar area once you passed that point. And we were just sat in there checking and we said, where's Derek? Where's Derek gone? Now, Derek was, well, it still is. He's still around. He was an elderly Welsh referee at amateur level, Derek Brown. You may have worked with him, actually. He's over 80 now. And nice man, lives in Merthyr Tydfil. And Derek had disappeared, and we were getting a bit worried about him. Where's Derek gone? Has he been taken ill? Has he got lost? What's happened? And it wasn't that long before we were getting on our flight. After a while, Derek turns up, right? And I said, Derek, what happened to you? He said, oh, they were searching through my stuff, my refereeing kit. They weren't interested in his pencil sharpener, which contained a blade. They weren't interested in his little spray for his gloves, to put a bit of dab on his gloves. It was his ball marker.
Okay.
When he's marking the balls to take it and clean it, that little bit of metal.
Yeah.
He was explaining to this woman, why do you need this bit of metal with a curve in it like that?
Yeah.
He said, it's a ball marker. And he had to explain it to this woman. He had to explain it to several members of staff. They were having none of it. None of them were snooker fans. None of them understood what this was for. Yeah. And we thought he was away for ages, and that's what it was. So Derek was missing. They didn't care about a blade in his pencil sharpener. They didn't care about his liquid that he had to spray. So that was one. And the other one is another one, Clive. He was on about the stuff he had to hand over when he was going to the first Australian Goldfields Open. He was commentating for Fox Sports. So this would have been about 2010, 2011. And, airports, ever since the 9/11 attacks, really, they've been very, very nervous. And that was the first time Clive had flown for several years. And they were saying, no, you must hand over this, must hand over that. No liquids, no this, no toothbrushes, no liquids, no nail clippers, no nothing. Right. And then he gets on the flight. And what do they give him there? A pair of nail clippers, some shaving equipment with razors. And that was all in the goodie bag. So he had to hand all that stuff over, gets on the flight, and hey presto, there it all is. So it's bonkers things that happen at airports and on flights. It's got to be the answer, Mark.
Fair enough. Right, I'm out of questions now for yourself. It's been an interesting chat, to be fair. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure, Mark. It's good to talk to you again. I know we haven't seen each other for a while, but it's good to talk to you. And good luck with this podcast. I think what you're doing is great.
Oh, thank you very much. We are trying our best. We've got a few more guests lined up, so we're going to be cracking on with that when we do them. So I'll say thank you very much to Marcus for joining me today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, however you're doing it. And I will see you next time. Hopefully, we're going to have a couple of young talents that play here at Tamworth Sports Bar, Oscar Newton and Nicholas Ayers, on the podcast, so that will be good for them. And I will see you soon. Say bye, Marcus.
All the very best. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.